The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Conspiracy theories spread by unknown parties for unknown reasons, well, they're not harmless. And in the case of human trafficking, they're actually making it harder for real victims to get the help that they need. We'll find out why tonight. Then, feminist Judy Rebick is with us to reflect on a new documentary that looks unflinchingly at her life, personally and as a career activist. It's a Judy you've never seen before. It's Thursday, November 26th, and that's next on The Agenda. Child abduction and human trafficking are real problems in this world and even in this province. But conspiracy theories, increasingly spreading online, not only don't help, but are also doing real harm, according to actual anti-trafficking groups working on the ground with victims. Joining us now for more on that and what motivates people to believe in such disinformation. From Waterloo, Ontario, by Lorne Dawson. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies and the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Waterloo. In the downtown core of the provincial capital, Judy Rebick, Executive Director, the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. And in Midtown, Ronelle Bruder, Founder and Executive Director of Project iRise. That's a survivor-led anti-human trafficking not-for-profit organization. And we're happy to welcome all three of you to TVO tonight for an important and sadly very timely conversation. Julia, can I just start with you and have you explain or perhaps clarify for us the difference between human trafficking and sex trafficking? Because we hear both of those labels used and we need to know if they mean the same thing.
Absolutely. So human trafficking in layman's term is what we refer to as when people exploit or coerce or take advantage of someone for financial profit or personal gain. So in Canada, when we talk about human trafficking, there's two major ways that we're seeing this play out. And one is sex trafficking. So that's when individuals are, again, coerced, forced, controlled, or manipulated or lied to engage in commercial sex acts for the trafficker's gain. But we also see it in terms of labor trafficking. So again, that is forced labor in Canada, where again, individuals are forced to work for the employer's gain.
And Lorne, just let's also clarify this. I know there are going to be people watching this right now who are going to be saying to themselves, what? This happens in Ontario? And the answer to that is what?
In terms of the trafficking, yes, yeah. Of course it happens. And where I am in Kitchener-Waterloo, I know there's been locally quite a bit of this. It's made it in local news and caused quite a sensation, especially out of Cambridge. So it's not just something in terms of, I think we also think of it in terms of young women being victimized coming into the country, but it's a matter of young women within the country being victimized as well. Now, part of the difficulty in trying to make headway on this issue is that there are groups out there right now that have, well, they may not feel this way, but certainly other people, experts such as yourselves, think that they are exploiting the situation for their own purposes. And to that end, and obviously not helping matters, and to that end, I want to read part of an open letter written by Freedom Needs Truth. This is a coalition of organizations dedicated to fighting human trafficking. And this is about the dangers of QAnon conspiracy theories before the last election. I think most people have heard of QAnon now. Here we go. Anybody, political committee, public office holder, candidate, or media outlet who lends any credibility to QAnon conspiracies related to human trafficking actively harms the fight against human trafficking. Let's get into that. Ronelle, how do the QAnon types harm the fight against human trafficking?
Well, what QAnon does and any sort of human trafficking conspiracy theories is really paints a picture of what trafficking looks like. But this picture is not reflective of the reality. And so stories of international child trafficking rings or people being kidnapped off the street. And even though these things do happen, the way trafficking normally looks like, what we're seeing particularly here in Canada, so domestic sex trafficking, is that young people are being trafficked by someone that they know. It's a family member. It's a boyfriend. It's a girlfriend. It's not somebody being kidnapped off the street by a stranger. And it's not likely someone's going to be involved in an international child sex trafficking ring.
Ronelle, do you know why they do this?
Why they make up these conspiracy theories?
Yeah.
I think because, particularly with sex trafficking, it is such a complex crime. It's something that's very hard for most people to understand. How could someone be victimized in this way? And so these conspiracy theories, to me, they're trying to simplify something that is so overly complicated in a way that most people will say, okay, this is what trafficking looks like. I can get behind that.
Julia, what impact do these conspiracy organizations have on your organization?
So as we mentioned, the common myths that already exist around human trafficking are not helpful to start off with. So again, many Canadians believe that this is an issue of foreign nationals or women being brought into the country and being trafficked here. And as mentioned, that's just simply not the case. This is a domestic issue. This is a national issue. And again, like Ronelle said, this is usually happening through someone that the individuals know and trust. So when these conspiracy theories go out, what it does is it fuels that fire of myths, and it really detracts from us being able to focus on the issue at hand in front of us, which again is incredibly complex.
And Lauren, I said earlier that I assume everybody knows what QAnon is, but maybe I shouldn't. They were big in the U.S. election. They even got somebody elected. But for those who don't know, maybe you could bring us up to speed on who they are.
Well, no one knows who Q is. He's an anonymous source, hence QAnon. He's an individual that did some postings. He started in October of 2017. The postings are quite cryptic. They have a sort of prophetic quality, and they're pretty much about various issues related to the culture wars in the United States and political agenda. And the main thing I think that caused the attention was that there's the implication has been made that Trump was somehow fighting a war against a kind of deep state cabal that was seeking to take over the United States. And then they linked into these sex trafficking issues because the implication was that the Democratic opposition to Trump was somehow promoting sex trafficking. And of course, there's the famous story spread that somehow Hillary Clinton and other leading figures in the Democratic Party were involved in a pedophile ring exploiting children. So QAnon exploited this prejudice that existed already amongst a certain fringe element against Democratic Party and sought to use it for their own political ends to gain support for President Trump.
Yeah, just to finish that story about Hillary Clinton, the allegation was that she was running a pedophilia ring out of the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., and somebody went down there with a shotgun hoping to, quote unquote, rescue all those kids. And yes. Thankfully, he was taken into custody before he could kill anybody, but that had the potential of really being quite tragic. Do you know, Lauren, why QAnon types seem to focus so much on pedophilia rings and human trafficking? This seems to be their thing.
Well, I think there's two things going on. So from the perspective of Q and those who are politically aligned with this source and promoting the conspiracy, they are just taking advantage of this to promote their political agenda, to gain support. Why it works is because in conspiracy theories in general, people are very interested in getting involved in a group that they think is involved in some kind of salvific function. They're going to save the world. They're a small group of people who have special knowledge and insight, and they're going to overcome a sort of great ignorance in the world, and they're going to rescue, particularly, the appeal is that they're going to rescue the innocent. They're going to rescue those who are being abused. So a large number of conspiracy theories or political propaganda in general usually uses motifs about women and children being raped, tortured, sexually molested, exploited, killed, etc., in order to galvanize this desire to come to the rescue of these people on the part of the audience.
Now, Julia, since this group has gained attention, in part because they endorsed Trump, in part because he retweeted some of their stuff on Twitter, have you been getting an increase in calls to your organization because of that?
So usually about 48 hours after a new hashtag comes out, like Save the Children or some of the conspiracy theories around Wayfair, we will get an influx in calls to the hotline. Luckily, we're not experiencing to the same degree as they are in the States with their anti-human trafficking hotline. So it's not actually disrupting our ability to serve other folks who might be victims or survivors on the ground. But we definitely see it. And in all honesty, we take it as an opportunity to share education and awareness about what human trafficking really is. But we definitely get people from across Canada, family members and just general folks, asking if this is real.
And when you tell them what's the truth, do they accept that, or do they think that you're part of the deep state, part of the hiding and all of this business?
No, they accept our credibility and our expertise. And I think part of that, too, is just the incredible skill of our hotline response advocates. Regardless who's calling on the line, we meet them where we are and we share information without prejudice and without judgment.
Okay, good to know. Ronelle, we just heard Wayfair referred to there, the online furniture store, and the role they play in all of this. Can you bring us up to speed on that angle?
So this past summer, a conspiracy theory started that Wayfair, the online realtor, was selling high-priced cabinets, but in actuality, they were selling children, and they were using these cabinets as part of their international child trafficking ring. And this really started with a online influencer who basically saw these names associated with these cabinets, and then it starts to spread, and it really spread like wildfire throughout the internet. The CEO of Wayfair actually had to go out and make a public statement saying that they are not associated in any way with child trafficking.
And when something like that happens, how do you fight back against that kind of garbage?
I mean, it's challenging because I had people reaching out to me personally because they know of the work that I do within the anti-trafficking space and saying, is this happening? Is Wayfair really associated with child trafficking? And of course, no, it's not. But it's the fact that because people see it online, because they see it, whether that's on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn, wherever they're seeing these stories, they believe it. And it's being retweeted over and over and over. So I think sometimes it's like, well, if everyone else is believing it, then it must be true. It's kind of like groupthink.
The producer of this segment, Colin Ellis, wanted to reach out and get a comment from a police service about this. And here's what the Toronto Police Service sent us in response to his inquiries. These conspiracy theories have no impact on our investigative efforts. We have no evidence to support the allegations made, and any attention given to these theories only detracts away from meaningful conversation on the issues of human trafficking and/or child exploitation. Lauren, since they don't seem to be having much of an impact on the police's ability to do their job, should we just ignore these folks?
Well, I would like to say we could just ignore them. And in Canada, thank God, really the impact has been far less than in the United States. But in the United Kingdom, for example, it's actually becoming quite a significant factor in political life there. So, and Canada, of course, can't ignore what's happening in the United States. In the United States, because of a sort of social facilitation, a general lack of trust in authority, a lack of trust in organizations, it is leading to some severe problems in terms of people not willing to believe what the police say, not willing to believe what their elected officials say for sure, and what bureaucrats will say. So it is a threat to democracy in the States. In Canada, it hasn't reached that point. However, in some anti-masker rallies and in some anti-immigration sites, etc. in Canada, QAnon material and references to QAnon are appearing. I think in Canada, as our general studies show, our higher level of trust in our government and in authorities and in expertise provides a greater buffer here for us, thank God.
Julia, what's your view on that? We do tend to have a higher level of trust in our institutions than they do in the United States. Is that protecting us from some of this?
It's hard to say. I think it's also just that, the QAnon conspiracies are really rooted in the political context of the United States. And that's very different here in Canada. So are we completely immune to similar conspiracy theories if they were actually responding to our existing politicians and our political climate? It could have more pickup. It's really hard to say. But I think one way that we've been able to manage the impact of these conspiracy theories is because, again, they're so deeply rooted in the American context.
Ronelle, what kind of impact do you think these conspiracy theories have on actual victims? Actual victims?
Yeah, actually, I think it has a really negative impact on victims because they're also hearing these stories. They're also hearing this idea or this narrative of what human trafficking looks like. And if that's not reflective of their experiences, then they might believe that, one, they're not being trafficked, they're not being victimized because they weren't kidnapped, because they're not part of an international child sex trafficking ring, then therefore what's happening to them cannot possibly be human trafficking. And I would say the same thing with survivors. So it's people who have experienced human trafficking and been able to get out of it might not want to reach out and go to services like the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. They might be hesitant to do that because they might think, again, well, this wasn't really human trafficking because he was my boyfriend or this was my best friend. And so it's not what trafficking looks like. Therefore, I shouldn't go and access these resources.
Julie, I still want to understand what the effect of giving legitimacy to these groups does on the work that you do. And I mentioned earlier we had this open letter that took aim at a large swath of influential groups that could lend credence to these conspiracy theories. We've already seen one QAnon supporter, a woman by the name of Marjorie Taylor Greene. She won a seat for the Republicans in Congress in the past election. And I wonder how concerned you are that these theories are going to be increasingly swallowed up by the mainstream.
I think that's a big part of our job, is about getting out there and sharing evidence and research and real information about how human trafficking is playing out in Canada. And that is a huge part of what the Centre does. I think also, to the first part of your comment as well, really kind of thinking through what some of the barriers to exiting are for survivors of sex trafficking. And specifically, it's also because of the intense stigma that's associated with any type of interaction with the commercial sex market, even if it's through human trafficking, but also the concern that they're not going to be believed. Again, there's this really intense sense, often instilled through traffickers through a trauma bond, that they did this to themselves, that it's consensual. And so it's our job to be able to make sure that people really understand that this is a crime, this is not okay, and that people are entitled to resources, support, and to access to the justice system.
Now, Lauren, I did point out that somebody got elected in the United States to Congress, not exactly on a QAnon ticket, but certainly in sympathy with QAnon. Could we here in Canada say, yeah, but that's down there. That's in the deep south of the United States. To the best of our knowledge, no QAnon supporter has been elected to any parliament or legislative assembly in Canada. So we're in the clear. Should we come to that conclusion?
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily. I mean, I'm not sure that this is going to impact things in terms of someone who's a devotee rising into political office. It can condition, of course, constituencies, right? It can condition the people back in people's ridings. And as a result, you know, if you want to be elected, you're not going to necessarily speak out strongly against certain views if you think they have, you know, some credence amongst a significant segment of the populace. That's the case, I think, in the United States. So we're often getting Republicans in particular who are just not willing to make flat out clear statements about QAnon on the suspicion that a part of their constituency subscribes to these views. And the problem with QAnon that makes it unique is, like any conspiracy theory, there are the core, hardcore believers. But QAnon, because of the conditions in the States, because of the Trump effect, because of social media, has achieved a kind of wider populace an audience than is the case for you know, previous conspiracy theories. And it means it's entered in this kind of new gray area that is problematic, especially for politicians, because they don't really quite know where the boundaries are between the hardcore believers and those who are voters, but subscribe partially to these ideas.
Julia, do you have any reason to believe that there are any people in high political places in this country who give this organization, QAnon, the time of day?
I've not seen any evidence of that in Canada.
And you're grateful about that, I presume?
I am incredibly grateful for that. And I think it says something about our institutions and our educational system, hopefully.
Ronelle, how about you? Any hints on this?
No, I haven't seen anything, not here, not in Canada, thankfully.
Okay. Lauren, I want to come back to you because, as we indicated off the top, you work in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Waterloo, and you study new religions. And I wonder whether you think QAnon is, in effect, a new religion.
Well, I think it shares elements that are common with new religions and new religious movements, because clearly people are getting engaged with this on a more than just kind of intellectual level. This involves emotional engagement, a commitment, and they're structuring their whole lives around it. A colleague just recently brought my attention to a Reddit site that is collecting accounts from family members explaining how their families have been destroyed, couples have divorced, mothers and fathers and children are alienated from each other because of the intensity of the commitment of some family member to the QAnon conspiracy theory. So there is a segment, we don't have data, this hasn't really been studied, but clearly there are people out there that are turning over, maybe under conditions of COVID isolation, they're turning over their lives almost completely, round the clock, watching for and looking for the messages. Now, a key element of QAnon too is a prophetic component, right? It's constantly, what Q is doing is dropping these cryptic prophecies and predictions. And of course, that has a very religious component to it, right? It's this sense, and he talks about trust the plans, stay the course, enjoy the show. And there's always a kind of apocalyptic component underlying this. So he's building on evangelical culture in the United States and drawing in these religious themes. So there are religious-like elements of what's going on, but it's hard to say if it would be a religion per se.
And we really have no clue at all about who Q might be?
There's been speculation, about certain government officials. There's been speculation that some of the people that are actually QAnon supporters online and are kind of now making a living off of promoting Q with products may actually be Q. But I've not seen any evidence that anyone has a clear idea who Q is. And there is the possibility now that a Q may not be one person. It could be a group of people.
And whether it's one person or a group of people, do we assume that they're male and American?
Well, that's the assumption. Yes, that does not necessarily mean it's so, right? The plot could go deeper, then we could have a conspiracy within the conspiracy, because this could be Russian individuals involved, right? Or something. It could be a disinformation program. I haven't seen anyone really talking about that, though. I think people are pretty convinced it's somebody within the United States because of the kind of texture of the references to American culture that are coming out in the Q drops.
Gotcha. Let's read something now by a woman named Annie Kelly. She's a PhD student at the University of East Anglia, which is in Norwich, England, and she researches the impact of digital cultures on anti-feminism and the far right. And here she is writing in the New York Times. She writes, "Just who is a believer in the sprawling, muddled world of QAnon isn't an easy thing to pin down. It's not like following a conspiracy theory requires a registration form. But what seems clear from the rally, from conversations I've had with other experts and my own research, is that there's something about QAnon that makes it stand out in the world of Trump-adjacent online groups. Its ranks are populated by a noticeably high percentage of women." Now let's get into this. Julia, why would women be more attracted than men to these conspiracy theories?
That's a great question. I think, in terms of general education and awareness, I think the issue of sex trafficking is something that really resonates with a lot of women. We've often identified that one of the biggest risk factors of, being at risk of trafficking is being a woman or a girl in Canada. And there's clearly gender dimensions in terms of how sex trafficking takes place. So I think it makes sense that, a lot of women are really interested in this issue because it is a gendered issue in many ways. Why they're clinging to conspiracy theories to kind of understand it, I'm not sure. I don't know what that gives them. Perhaps it's the simplicity of being able to explain it, in a clear way, when really it's very complicated, and it can be quite muddled.
Ronelle, any theories here on your end?
I think COVID-19 might play a little bit of a part as to why QAnon, especially right now, has been so popular. Because we're all going through this global pandemic. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of uncertainty, and especially with children online, in increased rates for school, for social means, I feel like QAnon and that child sex trafficking and that explanation of how human trafficking happens, it might be easier, especially for parents to digest, because they're afraid, they're concerned about their children, what's happening. And so now they kind of have a bad guy. They have someone out there that they know is the perpetrator, is the predator, when in reality, we've all said before, particularly with human trafficking, it's oftentimes somebody within the home or someone that's close to and has a relationship with the victim that is the trafficker.
Lauren, how about you on that?
Well, I think that we can generalize a bit, but we lack specific data. So, I mean, those who are drawn to conspiracy theories, as social psychological experimental work and sociological work shows, are people who are in a period of sweeping social transition and upheaval, like in terms of structural change to society. And they're people who are experiencing identity uncertainty as a result of this. They might be downwardly mobile, or they're finding that their significance in society is being questioned. So I think if we looked and found the women involved, like there have been some studies in the UK about it's grannies that are involved in supporting UK. So it's older women who are feeling kind of displaced, that their traditional role of significance in society has been downgraded under a kind of modern conditions of career women, etc. Now, we don't know that because we don't have data, but I suspect the data would show that educational levels of the women involved are lower, that they're more often homemakers or things of this nature and not career women. And I'm not denigrating homemakers. I'm merely saying that some of those people can feel that their traditional role of respect in society is declining. And so they're seeking for a knowledge and ways of increasing their role. One is to become a crusader for this cause.
Julia, I don't want to, I don't want to poo-poo, obviously, the efforts that we're making here to try to dismiss these conspiracy theorists. However, along comes a Jeffrey Epstein, who's a very rich and powerful guy. And, I guess the jury is still out on the role that associates of his might have played in the terrible things that he did, but he did sexually exploit numerous young women. And when a case like that comes along, I mean, presumably it puts a lot of wind in the sails of people who believe these conspiracies, no?
I mean, it can, but I mean, with the Me Too movement and not just Epstein, but also Weinstein, I think we should be at a point right now where we recognize that the sexual exploitation of women can be rampant. Right? That it's not just about, we should not be surprised to see that there are people that are exploiting women sexually across North America. And really, I don't see where the conspiracy theory plays out in terms of Epstein and Weinstein. They very specifically had power and influence, and they used that power and influence to be able to exploit women. That is something that I think we're realizing is more commonplace than we'd like it to be in Canada.
Okay, let's go around our virtual table on this one. Lauren, start us off here. For people who do spread these baseless conspiracy theories and make the genuine work that you're all trying to do much more difficult, how should we treat those people? What should we do about them? Lauren, you start.
This is a difficult one. I mean, in part, what you really need to do is partly what I guess social media is starting to do, which is you just have to stop giving them a platform and ignore them. And in a way, we're giving media attention to them. This is the conundrum you always get in almost all my fields of study, that in talking about something, you're actually giving maybe more significance to it than it warrants. Somehow you've got to find that right middle ground where we warn about this and draw people's attention to it, but not overly glorify the process. I mean, a lot of the people that are involved in QAnon, it's because it provides us a charge of satisfaction from being on the cutting edge of what they think is like new ideas, new material, secretive ideas. So the more we can kind of make it ridiculous to believe in these things, problematic to believe in these things, you're not going to hit the hardcore, but you are going to peel away the peripheral members that are really just being attracted to a fad. And that's what's really giving this oxygen right now in terms of media attention.
I take your point on that, but, let me follow up with Julia here. I guess part of the difficulty is if we don't have these conversations, people are going to read about these ideas on Facebook, and many people are going to take them to heart and believe them. And if there's no competing information in which to tell people, look, this is a bunch of garbage, and you need to know that, they will believe it. So what do we do about the folks who are trying to spread this stuff?
So we take an approach of focusing on education and awareness without going head on against QAnon, right? So we are working constantly at trying to build out research and to share information and to build awareness about this issue without necessarily hinging on the QAnon conspiracy theories. But again, we take this opportunity as well to engage with those folks and to share information about what's really taking place. So we've chosen not to give a lot of airspace to QAnon, but we are working to dispel those myths and to build better education around human trafficking every day.
Ronelle, is there anything in particular you can think of that we should be doing to people who want to spread these theories?
Well, I don't know about what you can do to people who are spreading them. To me, it's a teachable moment. I mean, if somebody comes to me with some sort of story or some conspiracy, then it's an opportunity to talk to them about how trafficking happens. It's an opportunity to give them information. So I think there is some positive that's come out of this is people are talking about human trafficking, and that's not something that we used to do. So just the fact that we're having this conversation here today is an example of there's more awareness and there's more education about human trafficking going on. This is going to help parents, community members. This is going to help young people from being victimized, and it's going to help support survivors. So I think there definitely is some positives even amongst all these conspiracy theories.
Lauren, I'm just wondering, though, if the long arm of the law can be brought to bear here. You know, at the very least, what these groups are doing is mischievous. At the most, at the other end of the continuum, you know, it's potentially dangerous, even fatal. So is there something the law can do here?
I don't see much right now. I mean, of course, this is the conundrum in our societies. We have quite justifiably a very strong commitment to freedom of expression, especially with views that have a political element to them. So I don't think we'd want to bring the law in. I don't think the law would be interested in being involved. If they crossed over to targeting specific groups or organizations and implying that some kind of violent response was appropriate, then hate crime incidents and legislation could start to kick in a certain way. But I don't think it's really risen to the point of a legal situation, beyond the fact that there are individuals on the far right in Canada that are hearkening to these ideas, that are already involved in a kind of a violent extremist culture, and they are being monitored by our authorities. And so there's a sense that there's a heightened awareness that when you start to see these QAnon ideas spreading in these communities, then more attention should be paid perhaps to those individuals, just in terms of monitoring them and being vigilant.
Understood. Let's thank Lauren Dawson from the University of Waterloo, Judy Rebick from the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, and Ronelle Bruder, who is the Executive Director of Project iRise. I want to thank all of you for being on the program tonight, and we have right there at the bottom of our screen for more information the 1-800 number for Julia's organization, so that if people do have further questions, they can call and get the straight goods. Thanks, you three.
Great. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone with a passing familiarity with the women's rights movement in this country, pretty much any time since the 1970s, knows Judy Rebick. She was a leading voice in the pro-choice movement, for pay equity, and on LGBT issues. She was a pundit, a journalist, and is founder of the progressive online platform Rabble.ca. But we learn a lot more about her in a new documentary on her life. For example, profound mental health difficulties she suffered, and an abusive relationship in her past. It's all detailed in Judy versus Capitalism, which screened at this year's Hot Dogs Festival and in October at the Rendezvous with Madness Festival. Plus, she's also released an autobiography called Heroes in My Head, a memoir. And Judy Rebick joins us now from the Annex in the provincial capital. You are multimedia all the time now, aren't you?
Yeah, lately I have been all sitting in my living room.
Well, good on you.
It's weird, but fun.
Let's start here, Judy. How much convincing did it take to get you to consent to having a documentary made about your life?
Not much in this case, because Mike Holboom, who's the director, is a very close friend of mine, and I know that he's an incredibly talented filmmaker. So when he asked me, I asked a mutual friend, Velcro Ripper, also a filmmaker, and Velcro said, Mike asking to make a film about you is like a great painter asking to paint your picture, paint your portrait.
Nice.
So, yeah, and so I said, okay, let's do it.
Well, you wrote.
It didn't take much convincing.
Right. You wrote the memoir not too long ago. So were there things that the memoir could not cover that the documentary does?
No, it's not that the memoir, the documentary was created quite separately from the memoir. I was writing the memoir while he was filming, while he was doing the interviews. So even though the book came out 2 years ago, film takes a long time to get going. The interviews were just his interest in various things and not so much based on the book. But of course, I was writing the book at the time. The one thing I talk about in the documentary that I don't talk about in the book is my struggles with weight. Somehow that came up with him, and it wasn't something that I decided to write about. So. That's about the only thing.
Right. We shall get back to that. You know, the funny thing is, you've been on the scene in Canada for so many decades. People may think you're from here, but you're actually not. You grew up in Reno, Nevada, which is. I grew up in. Yeah. Sorry. So go ahead.
I was born in Reno, Nevada, but my parents moved back to New York. My father was stationed there during the war. My parents moved back to Brooklyn when I was about 3 months old. So I didn't grow up in Reno. I grew up in Brooklyn.
Okay, that makes sense.
In Toronto.
Because you scream New York, I have to tell you, as you know. But I
left there when I was 10, but I'm really a Brooklyn Jew through and through. I know that. It's kind of weird, but true.
Well, I'm trying to ask this in an appropriate way without having you get into. Because I know there's an issue with your father that we're going to talk about eventually, but I don't want to touch on that yet. So maybe you can just give me the broad brushstrokes of what a childhood in Brooklyn, New York, for you was like.
Well, I grew up in Flatbush, which now is like little Jamaica in New York, but then was all Jewish. And until I was 5, we lived in my grandma's basement. So I spent a lot of time with my grandma, which was great. She really took care of me, I think, I remember her more strongly than I do my own mother. And, we had a very extended family in those days. I spent a lot of time with my cousins and my cousins' cousins. And that's what I remember most. School, we moved out of my grandma's house when I was when I was 5. And then we lived on our own, and that's when I started making more friends. It was pretty, in some ways, uneventful. You have Jewish holidays. My grandparents were very religious, so we practiced. My father, not so much. We practiced all the religion, and also my father was a great baseball player. Like he was. They invited him to come onto the farm team of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Like, I think he would have gotten onto the Brooklyn Dodgers team.
If not for the fact they didn't pay very much.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, you would have lived pretty close to Ebbets Field, right, in Flatbush. So did you guys ever go to the ball games together?
Every week. We went Saturday to the Dodgers, and Sunday watched my father play ball. So I was brought up with baseball. I can't stand it now, but I was brought up watching baseball.
Well, okay, now we get to the uncomfortable question that I was hinting at a moment ago, which is later in life you have come to understand that you and your father had a particularly distressing relationship. You want to touch on that?
Yeah. When I was in my 40s, my late 40s, I guess, 45, something happened. It was in the middle of, toward the end of the pro-choice struggle. And you might remember that there was a deaf woman in Toronto whose boyfriend, this is after abortion was legal, and her boyfriend tried to get an injunction to stop her from having an abortion. And for some reason, her sister freaked out, and I was trying to calm her sister down, and for some reason it triggered memories. And I remembered being abused as a child, as a little girl, and my mind was just flooded with these memories. So I called someone I knew in the pro-choice movement who was a therapist, and I knew she specialized in childhood sexual abuse, and I started to go to her, and within 2 sessions, I realized that the person abusing me was my father. And then about 5 sessions after that, this voice started speaking out of my mouth. I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but.
Well, in fact, you called it, I think, dissociative disorder. Is that part of it?
Yeah, the medical term is dissociative identity disorder, but back then they called it multiple personality disorder, which most people know about because Hollywood's really sensationalized it, right? 3 Faces of Eve, Sybil, all that stuff. And that's, it's not at all the experience that I had. But so everybody knows that term. And in terms of my experience, that term makes more sense to me, but it's not used medically anymore.
Do you think anybody else in your family knew what was going on in terms of the abuse at the hands of your father?
No, I don't think they knew, but, it's hard to tell because, back in those days, even now it's true, but back in those days, nobody talked about anything like that, and I told my grandmother, who's the person I was closest to, that my father was making me touch him. And my grandmother hit me and said, schmutz, which means dirt. Don't talk like that, right? So that was my attempt to tell somebody, and it didn't work. And so I had to protect myself. And the way this is how I see it. The way I protected myself was to create imaginary friends that took the abuse and hid it from me. That's how I experience it. The way that psychiatrists would explain it is that a child under 8, and it's very rare, if ever, that someone develops this condition if the abuse takes place later. It's something about the mobility of your brain, that it can be this creative, that it creates these characters who take the abuse and hide it from, because it's kind of unbearable. The person who's supposed to take care of you is abusing you. And so when you're 5 years old, you can't, it's unbearable. You can't stand that. So you dissociate from it. And the problem, and it worked very well. The problem was, it continued to be buried and continued to affect my health for many, many years until I could deal with it.
How old was your father when he died?
I think he was 89. Yeah, in his late 80s.
Did he ever face a day of reckoning on this issue?
No, I confronted him. I basically, when I was going through this, I was president of NAC, and I could do that, but I couldn't deal with talking to my father. So
That's the National Action Committee on the Status of Women.
Yeah. Yes. I cut off my contact with my parents for 2 years. It turned out to be 2 years. I thought it would be a couple of months, but it turned out to be 2 years. And then I got an invitation. While I was president of NAC, which was a very major women's group, I got invited to speak at a National Organization of Women conference in Miami, and they lived in Fort Lauderdale. And my brother said he would go because I wanted to. My brother wanted me to talk to my parents, and so he said he would go, so he would be there to support me because he had been my primary support through all this. And at first I confronted my mother. I had no intention of confronting my father. And my mother accepted it at first. But, she was sort of a genius at, denial, right? She denied she lived with this crazy guy. My father was really, I think he was, a narcissist. But he was very angry, and there was never violence, like physical violence in our home, because his father beat him. So he promised himself he'd never beat his wife or kid. But in the world, he was quite violent. He'd get into fights in the baseball. Whoever saw anybody fight in a baseball diamond, but my father did, And so she lived with that and pretended everything was okay. If you objected to his behavior, she'd say, "Oh, don't you know your father by now?" Right? So she did accept it, and she at first, and then she said, "Please, please confront your father. Please tell him." And my therapist didn't think I was ready to do that, but she was wrong. I went, and I think it was the most terrifying experience I ever had, driving from my motel to their house, getting ready to confront him. But of course, by this time, he was a fragile old man. And so when the alters, my therapist called them, the other personalities saw him, they stopped being afraid of him. And I confronted him, and he denied it, but he denied it in a way that was very pro forma, And then my mother said, "Well, can't we all just put it behind us now?" That was my mother's way of dealing, right? And so I could talk to my mother after that, but I didn't talk to my father much until they came back to Canada. So I did confront him, but he never accepted responsibility for it.
Was it at all satisfying to have that moment, though, of finally confronting him with that?
Well, yeah, the way it was is that my alter stopped being afraid, so it enabled me to heal and to integrate them. It was really a turning point in that way. that they saw he couldn't hurt them anymore. Because every time one of them would come out in therapy, they say, "Where's Jack?" That was my father's name. "Where's Jack?" You know? And once they saw that he couldn't hurt me anymore, they just pretty well disappeared. And so it was really very profound. And also it was a profound healing moment, because when I stepped, my brother saw that I was starting to dissociate, turn into a little girl, you know, in front of their eyes, right? And because it was so hard to do. And my brother saw that, and he said, "Judy and I are going to go now." And as soon as we stepped out the door, he put his arms around me, and I had probably the biggest cry I ever had in my life, letting it go. Yeah, so it was very healing, that moment, even though disappointing. You know?
You know, one of the things as I was watching the documentary that occurred to me is I've known you for almost 40 years, because
Wow.
I've covered all of your efforts to make progress on a whole host of issues that you've cared about. And, you know, and as I'm watching the documentary, I'm asking myself, all of this trauma and tragedy from her past, how has this had an impact on, you know, the rabble-rousing social justice crusader that she became? What do you think the answer to that is?
I think the answer is a couple of things. One is I grew up in the 60s. The first one is, so, you know, it was just like living and breathing to be a radical when I was a teen, when I was in university. So I think that's part of it for sure. But the other part is that because of what I went through, I say this, like, the dissociation gave me a kind of superpower, which was I was fearless. I never felt fear. I never even felt anxiety. Like nowadays, I feel anxiety, especially around COVID. And I say to people, "How do you deal with it?" Because I've never felt anxious before. And they go, "What? How could you not feel anxious?" But I never did. And I never felt afraid either. So it was kind of a superpower, and it helped a lot in the pro-choice movement. As you'll remember, there was real violence in that movement, people trying to stop us. And the other way is I think it made me much more empathetic, because I was, you know, hurt so badly as a child, and because I had this experience of being different people in a way. I could understand better, I think, with more empathy, what it would be like to be in a different skin, for example, or a different culture. And so I think I was much more empathetic, and that allowed me to get involved in anti-racist work and Indigenous solidarity work well before most white people did. Right.
Well, you mentioned the pro-choice.
Identify with those struggles.
Yeah, you mentioned the pro-choice movement, and we're going to show a snippet from the documentary because, well, here's Judy Rebick at work. Sheldon, if you would.
One day, I guess it was in the heat of the struggle, this guy came up to me. He was a pretty big guy, too. And he started, you know, yelling at me about killing babies, right? And then he put his hands on my throat, and he started to push me. And I think he wanted to push me into the train. But the thing was that I had some concerns about, especially crossing the picket line and, you know, and violence, taking a Tai Chi course. And one of the great things about Tai Chi is that they teach you to take a stance so that nobody can push you. You know, you take the stance, and the Tai Chi instructor was a big guy, would try and push you with all his might, and you get to the point where he can't move you. So I took my stance, and the guy couldn't do it, and I managed to get away from him when the train came and went into the train.
Well, we're going to follow up on that story with another one, because there was, you're laughing, but this was serious stuff. The man at the focus of the...
I do look funny at going on the train, though. You would admit that it looks funny.
Well, let's put it this way. The documentarian, he's very artistic in the way he tells your story. Let's put it that way.
Yes, indeed.
The man at the focus of the pro-choice movement at the time was an OBGYN named Dr. Henry Morgentaler. And somebody came at him with a pair of, what was it, a pair of scissors or a knife or something? Garden shears.
Yeah.
And you saved his life. Tell us that story.
Well, the clinic was opening. Dr. Morgentaler lived in Montreal, so we opened the clinic in the morning for the media. We didn't have any patients yet, and the media all took shots of me opening the door and, you know, up and down the stairs and opening doors on Harvard Street here in Toronto. And And Morgenthaler arrived from the airport at 3 in a taxi, and the taxi stopped across the street. And we escorted him across the street. We didn't expect any trouble because if you remember at that time, it was a conservative government and the anti-choice thought the government would take care of it and they didn't have to protest. That was at the beginning. So we didn't expect any trouble, but, we did stand on either side of him just in case. And as in the middle of the street, there was about 100 media there, and out of the media comes this guy. He walks right up to us, a middle-aged guy, and he grabs Dr. Morgenthaler with his arm. And I took his arm to pull it off because I realized he was up to no good. I didn't see the garden shears at first. And he had garden shears in his right hand. It was left hand that I pulled it. He had garden shears in his right hand. And I pulled him off Dr. Morgenthaler, and Cheryl, the other person who was escorting him, took Morgenthaler into the clinic. And then I saw that he had the garden shears, and I just pushed him away, and I said, "Get back. What are you doing?" And then I started to chase him down the street. That was the crazy part. Like taking care of, defending him against Dr. Morgenthaler, that part was my job. But then I followed him so I could find out where he lived, and that was the crazy part.
Yeah, what were you thinking there exactly?
I wasn't thinking. It was just instant, I gotta see where he's going so the police can get him. It was stupid. And Cheryl came out of the clinic to find me, and she yelled my name because she realized I was in shock, right? So I was not behaving rationally at that point. So yeah. The worst part of all of that, though, was testifying at his trial. That was the hardest thing one of the hardest things I've ever done because he looked so pathetic, And so anyway, yeah. I really didn't feel anything until the next day. Like all that night, I don't say this in the film, but all that night I was doing media, you can imagine it was a huge story, right? And then I was staying at a friend's house, so happened that night. And the next morning I just kept thinking, I have to go home. I have to go home. I have to go home. So like I said, I was in therapy. So I called my therapist and I said, he hadn't seen, it's not like now that everybody knows everything right away. He hadn't seen the news, so he didn't know what happened. So I explained it to him, and he said, well, you're in shock, Judy. You should go home and rest, And then I started to cry, and I cried for quite a long time. And I stayed home that day, and then I went back to work.
How would you characterize the state of your mental health today? Because you also tell us in the documentary you went through a terrible depression for a while as well.
Yes. I think Kai Chen, that's his Twitter handle, her Twitter handle, who's a poet, she says marginalized people never really completely get over a trauma. And I think it's true for most people. If you're traumatized, you learn how to handle it. It gets better, but it's always there. So like at the beginning of COVID, for example, facing, like I live alone, so facing being alone for so much. And I started to go down into that hole. I know it, it becomes familiar after a while. But now I have the tools to stop myself, and say, no, this is now, and I'm in a good place now. I'm safe, and so I've learned tools to deal with it. It's the personalities have been integrated. I mean, the last time I can remember, I think one of them came out, because I'm never really sure. It was probably about 8 years ago. In terms of depression, I think I'm always at a risk for depression, but I have tools that I've learned to not let myself go down that path, if you want.
Good.
And so that's how I've learned to handle it. And I also think I'm a nicer person now, actually. I think I'm much more sympathetic. I'm less angry. Politically, I've gotten more radical, not less radical. So.
Well, since I seem to be in the habit here of asking you very personal questions, but they are all addressed in the documentary, so I hope you think they're all fair game.
You think you have permission, yes.
Well, a little bit of license, yes, let's say that. Yeah. Let me ask you another one. You never had kids, Judy. Do you ever regret the fact you never had kids?
No. Because if I'd had kids, when I was thinking about having kids, when I was in my 40s, or in my late 30s, I was living with a man. And I thought, maybe I should have kids, It didn't happen. And I'm glad, because I think if I had kids, I would have had to deal with this earlier, and I wasn't ready yet. Because I would have, and then I wouldn't have been able to achieve all the things that I achieved in my life. I would have had to spend all my time dealing with my mental health problems so I could be a good mother. And I think being a good mother would have been so important to me that I would have done that. And then I probably wouldn't have been able to achieve what I achieved. So, and also I don't believe in regrets. I think they're a waste of time.
Well, in which case you're going to love this last question. You are 75 years old now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you just said a moment ago, you're a little mellower, you're a little happier these days. Do you still have that zealous fire in the belly to fight the next good fight?
Totally. You know what? When I got a tweet from Joe Cressy, who's my counselor, that said that for Thanksgiving, that the new rule is going to be that you can't, the bubbles are finished. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
The bubbles are finished. This was a few weeks ago. The bubbles are finished. You can only be with people in your household. And I said, what? Like, not even mention that there's like a percentage of the population that's single. Most of them lives alone, most of them women. And I looked it up, and it was 17%. That was in Canada. In Toronto, it's 32% of people. I can't even believe that stat, but I read it in the mainstream media, so it must be true. But anyway, you know, a lot of people are single, and they didn't even think of that. It made me really mad, and so I immediately tweeted Joe Cressy, and I guess other people did too, because they changed it. But so I felt that fire then, and I'm starting to feel it a bit around the long-term care stuff. And for sure, I feel I went to all those big Black Lives Matter demonstrations. That's what pulled me out of my funk. You know, for me, fighting to make the world a better place, that's healing. You know, all my activism has been healing. And when I went on those demonstrations, and they were so beautiful, they were so diverse, and young Black women leading them, and great politics, and part of a global movement, it made me feel so good and took me out of my funk completely. So I still have that passion for social justice, and that's what, you know, it's what gives me fire, gives me energy. Yeah.
Well, we are happy to remind people that they should keep an eye out for Judy versus Capitalism, which is the movie about your life. And as I say, I've known you for decades, and yet I learned so much new about you that I didn't know in that documentary.
Read my book, too. Heroes in My Head is my book.
That'll be next on my agenda. Very
Okay,
good. We're so glad you could spare some time for us tonight on TVO, Judy. You be well, okay?
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, November 26th, 2020. The most populous parts of Ontario are now in lockdown, and signs of COVID fatigue are beginning to show. Tomorrow, we'll check in on that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and Namki Wanuka. We'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Looking for more of TVO's in-depth current affairs and documentaries? Visit tvo.org/daily and sign up for our daily newsletter with links to agenda interviews, Steve Paikin's blogs, and preview our upcoming documentaries. That's all at tvo.org/daily.